The session that will be starting for the World War II and international order, two professors will present. For this session, the first speaker is the Dr. Brian P. Farrell from National University of Singapore. His specialty is the European military history and is British military history. 1942 to 1943, their plans and defense, 1940, 1942. And also, Empire, and then also he co-authored Empire in Asia, A New Global History. Today, he will talk about the Japan-British War as a global history during the period of World War II. So, Dr. Farrell, please.
Thank you very much. There has never been any serious dispute that the Second World War was a global experience, global in reach, impact, scope, and legacies. And in the long arc of scholarship, in English at least, the weightier and more important studies approached it accordingly. Gerhard Weinberg's magisterial 1994 book, A World at Arms, A Global History of World War II, set the compass for the field. Later works sought to enrich, not overturn this approach. For example, Richard J. Overy's 2021 masterpiece, Blood and Ruins, The Great Imperial War 1931 to 1945, depicted the global conflict as emerging from within, then destroying, a global order shaped by imperial projects and states. But only two of the great powers that fought the war did so in the way that most directly produces global impact, by fighting it as a global conflict, by conducting significant military operations in major campaigns across the globe. Only the United States of America and the British Empire may be said truly to have waged world war against common enemies. And only the British entity consisted at the time of a connected array of states, territories, facilities, and interests that truly spanned the globe. It was this fact that most directly ensured any war between the Japanese and British empires would reach the stature of an event in global history. The British were then the world's one real global empire. If Japan could not contain such a conflict and its repercussions within the region where it broke out, the impact was bound to be global. And, indeed, they could not. We may identify three things that made the British-Japanese conflict from 1941 to 1945 an event in global history. First, by attacking the British Empire in East and Southeast Asia in December 1941, the Japanese set off a chain reaction that connected this new fight to wars already waging in and around Europe. Second, any seismic changes in the prevailing regional orders of the Asia-Pacific were bound to have worldwide repercussions, given the size of the populations, economies, and assets of all kinds in those regions. And in 1941, the largest and most important external presence in those regions was not American, but British. The size and substance of British Empire interests of all kinds in the regions added up to a vital component not only of British power, but also of the global trading economy, especially in strategic raw materials such as oil, rubber, and tin. Last but not least, the impact this war would have on the web of political arrangements and strategic alignments the British developed with other powers guaranteed global impact. Three in particular stood out: India, Britain's Asian strategic reserve; Australia and New Zealand, the nearby self-governing dominions; and most of all, the USA. Many relevant dynamics were already in motion when the Japanese attacked the British Empire on 8 December 1941. But that attack, by triggering a war that could not be contained within the region, jeopardizing assets fundamentally important to the global trading order, and provoking reactions from the Americans as well as Britain's imperial allies, became a globalized military conflict from its first shot. This paper will analyze why it reached that level of significance, and it will make the most familiar of arguments. Context is king. Due to our time constraints, the presentation I'm making now will unpack the first two of these three themes, but make only a mention of the third in my overall conclusion. The full paper I will submit later for publication will unfold the complete analysis. The three themes identified above all, of course, unfolded at the same time. They were also entwined with and influenced each other. Here, we will look at them one at a time, but only to allow us to focus more clearly on the point at hand. The place to start is with the fact that attacking the British Empire meant triggering military operations that were going to have global effects. But it's crucial to note that the two main enemies in this fight were not affected by this dynamic in the same ways. Just as the British global presence was far greater than Japan's, so too was the British-American alliance far better aligned than the Axis coalition into which Japan drifted. Apart from such bits and pieces as German submarines operating in the Indian Ocean, minor exchanges of weapons and technology, and some intelligence sharing, the Germany-Japan axis fought largely separate wars against mostly common enemies. The Grand Alliance, forged by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, merged and pooled together into a fighting team, combining resources, plans, operations, and policies that not only achieved a greater level of coordination than any such coalition ever had, but also fought a truly global and coordinated war. Combined resources were allocated according to combined plans based on an agreed combined grand strategy that related the many different theaters and campaigns to each other and to an allied grand strategy. Of course it was not so smooth in practice, but loose and fitful Axis cooperation paled by comparison. One interesting example of that loose cooperation takes us into the heart of our first point: failure to contain war against the British to the Asia-Pacific. In December 1940, the Imperial Japanese Army sent one of its most eminent field commanders, Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki, to Europe to lead a military mission to Japan's Axis partners, Italy and Germany. Yamashita's principal interest was to study the methods and equipment the German army used to score its brilliant victories in Europe in spring 1940. To secure the kind of help needed to modernize the IJA. The mission did that, but also encountered German efforts to persuade Japan to start a war in Asia that they thought could help Germany deal with its European problems. The Germans forced France to surrender in June 1940, but the British fought on, fighting off a German onslaught from the air and gathering the strength to hit back. But Hitler's priorities shifted east, and from December 1940 onwards, his high command focused on what became the Titanic invasion of the Soviet Union, planned for June 1941. This left the British problem unsolved. That involved three problems. The German Navy struggled to wage an expensive Atlantic campaign to cut off the British Isles from overseas supply, using steel the army needed badly. Campaigns started by the Italians in and around the Mediterranean Sea escalated in 1941, dragging in German forces needed elsewhere. And the defiant British Isles sat poised on Germany's new left flank, a potential base for a repeat of the dreaded two-front war of 1914 to 1918 that defeated Imperial Germany. Yamashita's German hosts pitched his mission an idea. Japan now had a historic opportunity to bring about fundamental changes in an area of great interest to it, the Nanshinron, because the powers that dominated it were now all compromised by the war in Europe. They had a point. The French, who controlled Indochina, were now partly occupied and reduced to a rump state under German dominance. The Netherlands, which controlled the vast archipelago of the East Indies, was now occupied. And the British, who controlled Burma, Malaya, and much of Borneo, were fully engaged defending their home islands. This added up to a wide-open window of opportunity, one Japan must exploit. Hitler himself told Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke in March 1941 that Japan faced a now-or-never chance unique in history. Specifically, they should invade and conquer Singapore, the principal strategic base and main political position of the British Empire east of India. This would considerably weaken the British, which would compromise both their fight to preserve the Atlantic lifeline and any efforts they made to counterattack Germany in Europe. All that would surely make the USA think twice before concentrating its sea power in the Pacific Ocean. And all that would surely open up a vast area rich in raw materials to Japan. These German suggestions that their national challenges were entangled actually fed into an ongoing discussion in Tokyo. As early as June 1940, the French defeat in Europe prompted staff officers to look again at the strategic situation in the region we now call Southeast Asia. At least one, Iwakuro Hideo from the Army Ministry Bureau of Military Affairs, argued that if Japan launched an immediate surprise attack on Singapore, the Western powers, hard pressed in Europe, would not be able to repel it. A year later, while such discussions continued, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 forced the array of government and military authorities that shaped national decisions in Imperial Japan to make the cardinal decision. Should Japan take advantage of the German attack by joining it, by striking north to destroy once and for all the serious threat the Soviet Union and its Red Army posed to Japanese ambitions in China? Or should it instead exploit that attack by striking south to seize the now vulnerable territories in which Japan could find in abundance the natural resources it needed to prevail in its war in China? Step by step, Tokyo drifted into a consensus to strike south, which an arrogant Germany eventually welcomed in the hope this would indeed help protect its Atlantic flank. Neither Axis power made any serious effort to follow up on their discovery they had some apparently overlapping interests in grand strategy. They opted instead to wage simultaneous but only parallel wars in which many important possible connections were just never made. The Axis failure to make connections became a defining feature of the war that now escalated in Southeast Asia between the British and Japanese empires. The strategic situation in the South and Central Pacific quickly settled into a direct clash between the Japanese and the Americans. The Dominions provided increasing contributions, but not until the very late stages of the war did the British, already globally strained, deploy in this theater in force. The Japanese, by overrunning Southeast Asia, interposed themselves between India and Australia. The Allies recognized this fact in March 1942, dividing this part of the world into spheres of principal responsibility for directing military operations. But while the British found themselves almost without a voice in the Pacific theaters, the Americans played a much greater role in the Indian Ocean theater that was supposed to come under British direction. The Allies did leverage connections. The pre-war American presence in the Philippines left them interested in Southeast Asia. Washington's hope to make China the main base from which to stage the final Allied offensives against Japan made the Americans determined to remain involved in directing campaigns from India and Burma, now the only supply lines through which to sustain China. Allied squabbling over plans, priorities, and operations in this region was non-stop. But the point is that they saw and acted on the connections. The Japanese advance to the south meant that American-led operations in the Pacific and Allied operations in Burma and India had to be related to each other, which also meant relating both to the campaign in China and securing in Australia as an essential base and communications link. As the British concluded their long and painful retreat from Burma into eastern India in April 1942, staffs and planners in New Delhi, Cairo, and London had already identified one potentially grave concern. The India-based staffs referred to it as an Axis junction. Perhaps the German and Japanese fleets would make a determined effort to combine to sweep Allied sea power out of the Indian Ocean. Simultaneously, or on their own, German and Japanese ground and air forces would prosecute strategic offensives to converge on each other. The Germans moving south through the Caucasus or east through the Middle East, towards the Japanese moving west through India. This greatly exaggerated Axis capabilities, but at their low point, the British reviewed it carefully. They knew that if the Axis shattered British power in India or seized control of the oil fields in Iran and Iraq, the UK might face global military disaster. In due case, their anxiety abated, but only after close consideration. The Axis powers never even considered or seriously discussed all this. Neither approached their military problems from December 1941 onwards from a point of view expressed by any global review. Quote, "How might we best combine our efforts to break the Allied coalition now arrayed against us," unquote, was a question never reviewed by any meeting involving the highest levels of national command in Berlin and Tokyo, or even staff representatives. By contrast, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their chiefs of staff met in war summit conferences a dozen times from autumn 1941 to the end of the war against Japan. On every occasion, they discussed, debated, argued, boy did they argue, and decided how to coordinate the wars they were fighting, how to balance their choices of priorities and allocation of resources. When it seemed that Soviet intervention in the war against Japan would be necessary to terminate that war, the Allies negotiated this at the summit. Other than encouraging Japan to attack Singapore, then declaring war on the USA to help motivate the Japanese to finish what they started, no one in any command position in Berlin or Tokyo ever made any effort to try to forge any global Axis grand strategy. Both Axis powers certainly came to understand how heavily their own war relied on their partner on the other side of the world, pressing the Allies very hard in his war. From mid-1942, for example, Shigemitsu Mamoru, then ambassador to the Chinese regime in Nanjing, argued forcefully that German problems in their war in Europe directly affected Japan's own strategic situation, and the connections must be carefully considered. His eloquence carried him back to Tokyo to become foreign minister when his papers impressed Prime Minister Tojo. But Shigemitsu then concentrated on trying to strengthen Japanese diplomatic and political efforts to secure more support from Asian countries it occupied, rather than on prompting efforts to harmonize grand strategy with Germany. While the Allies argued over such details as competing demands for landing ship, tank, and transport aircraft between planned operations in Burma and those in the Mediterranean, the Axis settled for those occasional visits by submarines. There was never any comparison. Japan provoked a war in a theater in which its principal enemy was the British Empire, but that enemy never stood alone and never ring-fenced that war from its other global challenges, nor lost sight of its place in global grand strategy. Both the British and the Japanese never regarded their war against each other as their top priority. But the British could afford that luxury once the Americans entered the war, due to a Japanese attack against them both, which was never coordinated in any way with Japan's only serious ally. So much for grand strategy. In what ways did the British-Japanese War reach global stature due to the effects the conflict had on prevailing arrangements for geopolitical and economic order? The global political and economic order in the 1930s was dominated still by empires. In 1942, the Japanese shattered several of them with great speed. Before anyone could even begin to digest this disruption, this new Japanese imperium collapsed in 1945 even more rapidly. Combined, the two sudden and drastic disruptions in prevailing orders hit those arrangements with the force of a geopolitical earthquake. Three regional orders were affected: East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, India. It is fair to say that by 1941, the British presence in East Asia, effectively China, rested on Japanese sufferance. But that was no small thing. The British, not the Americans, had been the principal Western presence in China and the long-standing pillar of the treaty system by which the great powers sought to control China's integration into the global order. Japan's transition from an important member of this system to a power determined to replace it by one of its own design was complete by the autumn of 1937, with the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And by this time, the British and Japanese empires already saw each other as antagonists. Major war in China was bound to affect prevailing order in a region that at the time did not even have an agreed name, the region we now call Southeast Asia. That label was in fact generated by the Japanese onslaught in 1941, which was itself designed to make it possible for Japan to prevail in the quagmire in China into which it had stepped. Seeking the means of war in the southern resources area, the Japanese armed forces prosecuted a well-managed offensive that in 6 months evicted the Western powers from the vast space between Calcutta and Darwin. Colonial regimes fell so fast that everyone was everywhere caught unprepared, forcing them to scramble to address the new geopolitical reality. Instead of being divided into different polities, for the first time in its history, the entire region experienced the same thing at the same time: Japanese occupation. Historians of Japan, I could name many, such as Akashi Yoji and Jeremy Yellen, have made it clear that while Japanese authorities at home and on the spot did discuss a variety of ideas about how to reorder the region, and in some cases, as we've heard, they did take some action, all such broader reordering ambitions were quickly marginalized when Japan lost control of the Pacific War and found itself fighting for survival. Japanese policy thus became in practice to concentrate on extracting as many resources as it could from the region, as quickly as it could. This only aggravated an already often harsh occupation regime and greatly compromised efforts such as those by Shigemitsu to rally Asian countries now under Japanese control to join any Japanese effort to create an Asia for the Asians. Every country in what is now ASEAN found its political trajectory swept up in these great upheavals. Just as notable were the spillover effects from the Great Retreat of 1942, when Japanese forces compelled British forces to abandon Burma and fall back into its neighbor, India. The humiliations to British arms suffered right next door helped trigger one of the last great challenges to the British Raj in India by Indian nationalism: the Congress Party's Quit India campaign. There now appeared to be both the threat of a Japanese invasion and the challenge of an uprising, provoking alarm in London about the British position in India. The Indian Army, rapidly expanded after the fall of France, provided essential assistance in East Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, helping to deny the vital oil fields to the Axis. That army was also the principal force with which the British tried to defend Southeast Asia and hoped to regain it. At the turn of the century, then Viceroy George Curzon declared that if the British lost India, they would, quote, drop straight away to a third-rate power. this still rang true in London. To prevent that, the British were forced to secure India with more British battalions than they could deploy along the front line facing Burma to engage the Japanese. Unwanted American criticism also forced them to launch a sincere but failed political effort to reach an agreement on future status with the Congress leaders they had to jail. The prospect of British power leaving India was already a question of when. But this great escalation of pressure caused by Japanese militarism now accelerated that process, as British wartime Deputy Prime Minister and Labour Party leader Clement Attlee well understood. Indeed, through this whole vast arc of territory, from India to the Philippines, the rapid Japanese conquest, followed by the sudden Japanese collapse, plunged the whole area into fundamental political upheaval. The war waged by the Japanese against the British Empire either triggered or accelerated turbulent political changes throughout. Imperial Japan could not realize any vision other than that of the great disruptor. But on that score, it could claim some role in sparking events that led to post-war independence, partition, and bloodbaths in India, successful violent nationalist rebellion in Indonesia, a failed communist effort to prosecute a violent social revolution in Malaya, and a series of wars in French Indochina. The Japanese could not maintain their bid for empire, but the European imperial powers could not rebuild their imperiums. In particular, the emergence of India as an important global state and the impact of the wars in Vietnam on the Cold War underlined the global nature and impact of a fight between the British and the Japanese over dominance in two regions that their war wound up defining, South and Southeast Asia. My full paper will go on to analyze how and why the British Empire's need for help in their war against Japan triggered changes in the UK's relations with their dominions, and especially with the USA, that reinforced the global nature of that war. The main consequence for the British of defeat in 1942 was that it forced them, literally, onto the sidelines in the war against Japan. That obliged the Americans to assert their far greater strength to become, through victory, the principal external power in the Asia-Pacific regions. That aligned with the status they now exercised as the principal architect of a new global order. To conclude this shorter presentation, it is pertinent to point out that the British-Japanese War was global in every respect, in its conduct, in its military and political effects on the even larger global struggle, and in its post-war military and political repercussions. The intractable war in China into which it stumbled led Imperial Japan to launch a military bid to reorder no less than 4 geopolitical regions. The idea that their great offensive in 1941 should attack only the British and Dutch and try to avoid hostilities with the Americans was indeed a dangerous illusion, as the Navy clearly understood. The great rationale that Japan could contain and limit any war against the Western Allies was self-delusion. Japan wanted total victory, a political outcome that would change the world. It could not escape waging a war on that level. There were no off-ramps. Thank you very much.